In Star Wars, planets are introduced with sweeping music and painterly visuals, yet they are rarely treated as lived-in places, instead functioning as abstract nodes on a strategic map, valuable not for the civilizations they sustain, but for what they provide to the conflict at hand, a habit that quietly redefines entire worlds as expendable pieces in a galactic game. From the moment hyperspace lanes are explained, planetary worth becomes a matter of positioning. A world's importance is calculated by proximity to trade routes, access to resources, or military leverage, and the people living on those worlds become secondary considerations at best. This logic permeates every era. Decisions are made in war rooms where glowing holomaps replace cities, cultures, and families with icons and grid lines. And once a planet is reduced to a symbol, its destruction becomes easier to justify. Alderaan is not destroyed because it poses a tactical threat. It is erased to send a message. Its annihilation framed as a demonstration, rather than an act of war, signalling that civilian life is acceptable collateral when psychological dominance is the objective. Scarif follows a similar pattern, a populated world turned into a kill zone not because it must be conquered, but because containing information is deemed more important than preserving lives, and the film moves forward as soon as the data is secured. Jeddah is presented as a holy city, yet its partial destruction is treated as a warning shot, its cultural and spiritual significance outweighed by the need to test a weapon, and the suffering of its inhabitants fades quickly once the narrative shifts back to the protagonists. Hosnian Prime is perhaps the clearest example. A galactic capital, obliterated in moments, billions killed instantly, and yet the event functions primarily as a tonal reset, clearing the board so the conflict can escalate without political complexity. Each of these moments reinforces a dangerous normalization. Planetary destruction is not framed as an unthinkable atrocity, but as a grim necessity, an unfortunate but effective solution to narrative problems that might otherwise slow the story down. Governments within the galaxy internalize this logic. Worlds are defended only so long as they remain strategically convenient, and the moment the cost of protection outweighs the benefit, those worlds are quietly abandoned. This abandonment is rarely announced outright. It happens through inaction, delayed responses, or political hesitation, allowing leaders to maintain moral distance while entire populations are left to their fate. The Republic debates procedure while systems burn, the Empire calculates acceptable losses with bureaucratic efficiency, and even the Resistance chooses its battles carefully, knowing it cannot afford to save everyone. This selective protection exposes a harsh truth. No faction truly treats its planets as homes first and assets second. Security is conditional, extended only to worlds that serve the larger strategy. The scale of the galaxy exacerbates this detachment. With millions of systems spread across unimaginable distances, loss becomes statistical. Another entry, in a casualty report too large to emotionally process. When destruction occurs at such magnitude, mourning becomes impossible to sustain. Grief is compressed into brief reaction shots before the story moves on, training both characters and audience to accept annihilation as part of the background noise. This emotional compression is not accidental. It is a coping mechanism within the narrative. Acknowledging the full weight of planetary loss would paralyze decision-making and derail the heroic arc. Rebuilding is therefore treated as an afterthought. Once a planet falls, the camera leaves with the heroes. Refugees scatter into anonymity, and the long-term ecological, cultural, and psychological damage is left unexplored. No film lingers on displaced populations struggling to survive. No trilogy centers on the generational trauma of planetary annihilation, because doing so would reframe victory as hollow and incomplete. The galaxy is structured to absorb loss without reckoning. Another world will take the destroyed planet's place in trade networks. Another base will be built, another capital declared, reinforcing the idea that no single world is truly irreplaceable. This disposability seeps into strategic language. Worlds are described as strongholds, targets, or liabilities, rarely as communities with histories worth preserving beyond their immediate usefulness. Even when leaders express regret, it is framed abstractly, sorrow for the loss rather than rage at the decision that made such loss inevitable, allowing the cycle to continue unchallenged. The normalization of planetary death reshapes moral scale. When billions can die in seconds, smaller atrocities fade into insignificance, and the threshold for acceptable suffering rises with each escalation. This inflation of horror is one of the saga's most unsettling undercurrents. The more destruction becomes common, the less shocking it feels, conditioning audiences to accept outcomes that would otherwise be unthinkable. Sacrifice rhetoric reinforces this conditioning. Mass death is reframed as noble when it serves a larger cause. Entire populations are retroactively assigned meaning through the language of necessity. Yet those populations never consent. Their sacrifice is assumed, their voice is absent from the decision-making that seals their fate, revealing how easily moral responsibility is outsourced to abstraction. The galaxy's leaders speak of protecting the many, but rarely define who counts, and planets on the periphery consistently discover they are not included in that calculus. This pattern teaches a grim lesson. Survival in the galaxy depends less on innocence or need than on strategic relevance. And once relevance is lost, so is protection. Star Wars presents this reality without fully interrogating it, allowing planetary destruction to function as spectacle rather than systemic failure. And in doing so, it quietly trains acceptance. Acceptance that some worlds will burn so others may live. Acceptance that grief must be brief to keep the story moving. Acceptance that suffering is replaceable at scale. It is here in this conditioned indifference that the narrative begins to shape not just its characters, but its audience, preparing us to move on just as quickly as the galaxy does, without asking who is left behind. From this foundation, the story's perspective narrows further, focusing ever more tightly on heroic motion, while the aftermath recedes into silence. A silence that carries consequences the saga rarely allows itself to confront. The way the story teaches acceptance of planetary loss is subtle, cumulative, and deeply effective. It does not argue that destruction is good, it simply refuses to stay with it long enough for the horror to fully register, and that absence of attention becomes its own form of permission. The camera follows heroes in motion, starfighters launching, doors sealing, hyperspace lines stretching, and in doing so it physically leaves devastation behind, training the audience to associate narrative momentum with moral progress, even when progress is built on ash. We rarely see survivors because survivors complicate victory. They slow the story, demand resources, and raise questions that cannot be answered with bravery alone, so they are pushed to the margins, where they become background texture rather than subjects. This framing conditions us to equate resolution with escape. If the heroes get away, the story moves forward, and whatever remains behind is implicitly treated as unresolvable or already paid for. Planet-killing weapons accelerate this conditioning by warping moral scale. Once annihilation becomes a recurring possibility, every lesser harm feels comparatively small. Blockades, starvation, displacement, and occupation blur into acceptable costs because they are not total erasure. The Death Star does not just destroy Alderaan, it destroys proportionality. After it fires, the story's ethical landscape is permanently altered. The line for what constitutes an intolerable act is pushed so far outward that almost anything short of planetary extinction can be absorbed. Later superweapons reinforce this shift. Starkiller Base does not escalate horror so much as normalize repetition. The audience has seen this before. The shock is shorter, the grief more compressed, and the narrative moves on with increasing speed. This repetition teaches emotional efficiency. Feel bad briefly, then refocus on the mission, mirroring how characters themselves must function to survive. And in aligning audience psychology with wartime necessity, the story quietly recruits us into its logic. Sacrifice rhetoric completes the lesson. Loss is reframed as noble when it advances the cause, and once framed that way, questioning it becomes morally suspect. To ask whether a planet should have been saved sounds like doubting the worth of the victory it enabled. Entire populations are posthumously enlisted into meaning, their deaths justified by outcomes they never agreed to, their annihilation transformed into narrative fuel for someone else's arc. This is not limited to villains. Even heroic factions rely on this framing. Leaders speak solemnly of what was lost, then immediately pivot to what must be done next, signalling that mourning has a strict time limit. The resistance, despite its moral positioning, operates under the same constraints. It cannot afford to dwell, cannot afford to rescue everyone, and the story validates these choices by rewarding persistence rather than reflection. In this way, no faction truly protects its worlds when it matters most. Protection is aspirational, not guaranteed, and the promise of defense dissolves the moment it conflicts with survival or strategy. The Republic fails by hesitation, the Empire fails by design, and the Resistance fails by limitation. Yet the outcome for civilians is often the same: abandonment followed by silence. The galaxy's sheer scale reinforces replaceability, with countless systems waiting off-screen. The loss of one becomes narratively manageable. Another desert, forest, or city planet will take its place, visually distinct, but functionally interchangeable. This interchangeability bleeds into world building. Cultures are sketched broadly, ecosystems simplified, and histories implied rather than explored, making it easier to accept their erasure without feeling the weight of uniqueness. When a planet is destroyed, what is truly lost is rarely shown. Languages, traditions, family lines, and art vanish instantly, yet the story seldom pauses to acknowledge that an entire civilization has ended. By not showing what is lost, the narrative avoids confronting what cannot be replaced, and in doing so it subtly endorses the idea that the galaxy can keep going without consequence, that suffering at scale is survivable so long as the plot continues. This perspective reshapes heroism itself. Heroes are not measured by what they preserve, but by what they overcome. Their success defined by motion, through danger rather than stewardship, of what already exists. Saving a planet is rare and fleeting. Destroying a threat is decisive and cinematic, and the story consistently chooses the latter because it resolves tension cleanly, even if it leaves devastation unresolved. Over time, this trains acceptance not just of planetary loss, but of a world view where protection is conditional and disposability is normal, a galaxy where being important enough to save matters more than being innocent enough to deserve safety. The audience learns this lesson alongside the characters, absorbing the idea that tragedy is inevitable, grief must be brief, and the greater good will always require someone else to pay first. This does not mean the saga endorses cruelty, but it does mean it prioritizes momentum over mourning, and that priority shapes how meaning is assigned to death and survival alike. By the end, planetary destruction functions almost like punctuation, a way to mark escalation or transition, rather than a moral event demanding reckoning. And once destruction becomes punctuation, it loses its power to interrupt. What remains is a galaxy that runs on replaceable suffering, where if one world falls, another will fill its role, another population will mine the ore, guard the lane, or host the base, and the system rolls forward unchanged. The unsettling implication is that peace in such a galaxy is not the absence of loss, but the management of it, deciding which worlds can be sacrificed without destabilizing the whole. Star Wars rarely asks whether this logic is acceptable. It simply shows it operating, leaving the audience to feel inspired by individual courage, while slowly acclimating to systemic indifference. In this light, heroism becomes both necessary and insufficient. Brave acts matter deeply in the moment, but they do not alter the calculus that renders entire planets expendable in the first place. The saga's enduring power comes from this tension, hope shining brightly against a backdrop that remains fundamentally hostile to permanence, safety, and memory. Every victory feels earned, yet every victory rests on losses that are never fully named, mourned or repaired, creating a universe where forward motion is possible, only by refusing to look back too long. And so the galaxy survives, not because it protects its worlds, but because it replaces them, telling stories of bravery to soften the knowledge that somewhere, someone was left behind so the story could continue.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.